with this today as we work our way through more Russian art. So we're working our way up to constructivism by talking about what was going on in Russia prior to the constructivist movement, which really doesn't begin until the end of the 1910s, right? And so we were looking at Rayonism, this movement that really centers around these two people, right? Mikhail Larionov and Natalia Goncharova. And I'm not going to talk about them a lot because we don't have any good examples here in D.C. Suffice to say that the Russians, as we saw last Friday, are very much influenced by French modernism, and in particular Cubism, right? But also picking up, even though they're not French, the Futurists, because the Futurist movement was so much influenced by Cubist art, but also by the Golden Section group, right? There's the deep tie between those. And Goncharova and Larionov actually had heard Marinetti speak when he'd come to Russia, so there's a direct connection to the Futurists as well. Remember Marinetti, the head of the Futurists, right, the poet, and wrote the manifesto and whatnot, right? So there are these connections to these things, and there's also, I think, a connection theoretically to Delaunay and Orphism, and the idea that light can obliterate solids, right, visually. Because remember that the Rayonists talk about the fact that they're not trying to paint the object so much as they're trying to paint the rays of light that emanate from the colors of those objects. And that those rays of light are more important than the object itself, stand in front of it in a way, obscure it. And that is, in fact, very, very close to the sorts of things that Delaunay was saying in his particular brand of Orphism, where, again, the rays of light can obliterate solids. Now, what the difference is, and this is something we'll see kind of a back and forth with Russian art, is that for the Rayonists, it's a lot more pragmatic. It's not as metaphysical and spiritual. It's sort of more scientific in a way, at least their approach to it. They don't see these rays of light as having some sort of, spiritual sustenance. For Delaunay, and the fact that he embraced the term Orphism, right? Orpheus is the character who goes to the afterlife, goes to the underworld, and then comes back, right? Dances between the physical world and the metaphysical world, the physical world and the supernatural world, right? The fact that Delaunay accepts that as a term certainly tells us that he sees color and light as having a spiritual component. But for Larionov and Goncharova, it's more pragmatic. It's much more earthy than that. Now, this isn't true for all of the Russians. It's just kind of true for them. And in fact, they form a group called the Jack of Diamonds. And various other members were part of this. And the group will fracture over exactly this issue, over the issue of tangible reality, physicality, which they're applying to their paint, and a more spiritual approach to things, right? We'll actually fragment the group, and it will become, as we get into the 20s, even into constructivism, will be a sort of a divider between sort of two camps of modern art in the Soviet Union, right? And after 1917, we stopped talking about Russia, right? We start talking about the Soviet Union. That's the October Revolution, right? Okay, so Malevich on the right is a member of the Jack of Diamonds group. And it becomes pretty obvious that he too has been looking very strongly over to Paris, to works of art in Paris, as one of his most prominent influences, right? And in particular, I don't know if I've got a slide coming up, I probably do, but out of order, he's been looking at those purist works. Remember, there's this other Cubist offshoot. We talked about the Orphists more than anything. But there were the purists with Fernand Léger, who brought a sort of mechanized quality to Cubism, a machine-like quality. And Malevich does this even more so by changing the colors from this. Let's see if it's coming up here. Yeah, here, we'll jump ahead and then come back. So here's Leger, right, working in Paris with this purist sort of aesthetic of these cylindrical forms, right, that have a certain shine, a certain gleam to them by the way he's applied the colors, especially the blues to those. They look like snare drums, you know, with the polished sides. And Malevich takes this a step further by getting rid of these primary colors that Leger is working with and replacing them with machine colors, right? So he certainly is very much influenced by French modernism, but that's been the norm, right? That's been what we've come to expect from Russian modernism, is this casting their eyes toward Paris, which really was the major capital of modernism, despite Kandinsky in Munich, you know, despite Kirchner in Dresden. Paris was where everybody looked. Right? Okay, going back, picking this up out of order. So he's with the Jack of Diamonds group. One of the things that I find fascinating about this within a historical perspective is the fact that the subject matter is a woman carrying pails. Can you see it? Right? So a peasant woman, right, walking from, you know, who knows, the farm or the well, right, and carrying whatever liquid that might be, whether it's milk or water, back to the farmstead. And the dress becomes these cones around her body. Then we see the crossbar over her shoulders and the two pails hanging from it. And then the rest of the background also translated into a series of cones and cylinders. And that should kind of raise a red flag in your mind, the fact that I just said cones and cylinders. Because remember what Cézanne said, the famous quote from Cézanne when we first went back and looked at it, that the world, everything, is cones and cubes and cylinders. Everything is geometrical shapes. And this is part of that ongoing legacy of Paul Cézanne. Right. Well, the reason I got Lenin's name up there, Vladimir Lenin, is that one of the things that he was writing beginning in like 1906 was that Russia had to make an effort to pull itself out of the 19th century, pull itself out of old traditions. And the way to do this, Lenin said, was to industrialize, to embrace the potential of machinery, to improve the lives of everyday Russians, the lives of, we use, you know, his early socialist writings, the lives of the proletariat can be improved by the application of the machine. And what's fascinating, of course, is that Malevich has taken a rural peasant scene and has applied the machine to it. It's almost as a visual analogy to the sort of political ideas that Lenin was writing about. Right? The machine applied to traditions will improve the lives of those people. Yeah.
Would that be sort of saying that machines are replacing people?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if anybody was really fearing that yet in 1911, 1912. I think that if the fear was that machines would replace people, then I don't think Lenin would have been saying. See, because the foundation of socialism, right, under Lenin, Marx prior to him, but under Lenin in the 20th century, is the idea that workers' lives have been ignored, the rights and the conditions of the working class have been ignored going back to the Middle Ages. And that what used to be the feudal system, where lords enslaved people, right, was sort of replaced by an industrial system where owners of factories enslaved the workers of the factories who work for the profit of the owner and not for the profit of themselves. And what Lenin is arguing, as much as anything, is to get away from that system, that top-down sort of system, and allow everyone to have, this is socialism, right, communism, is to allow everybody to have access to that progress on the individual level in order to improve their lives. So I don't think that this is a long way of saying, I don't think he's afraid of the machine replacing people.
So this is positive, this is permanent.
Very much so, yeah. Very much a positive impact of the machine on modern life. And in fact, that's something, that's a really good question, because that's something that we've seen repeatedly prior to World War I, is the positive impact of the machine. Right? And I think the influence of the machine is one of our little tick points on our study guide for the midterm, right? And one of the things that we find is that the attitude toward the machine, the attitude toward industry prior to World War I was significantly more positive. Now, there may be outliers. There may be some people that I'm not thinking of right now that negate this. But on the norm, right, the lion's share of people who are interested in machinery, industry, see it as a sign of solid progress that will benefit everybody, that make the opportunity to, and if they are replacing people at the workplace, that means there can be more leisure. So long as just a few don't profit from it, as long as everybody has a chance to. And we'll see with Malevich that modern applications of machinery remain for him an incredibly positive thing. And in fact, one of the things that will separate him from the Jack of Diamonds group is he goes to the spiritual side of things, where he starts to see a connection between industrial machinery and metaphysical ideas. Right? And this will come up in just a second, but just to preface that, right, is that he sees machinery as allowing us to, as people, to do things we could never do before. Things that alter our experience in a positive way. Think of airplanes. Okay, an airplane allows you to fly. It's machinery, right? But it allows you to have this experience that is really metaphysical, right? Metaphysical. Go ahead.
So that would be like machines like cows in the farm, not like factory or.
That's right, exactly right. But even so, that's still a factory in a way, because factory simply means, the word factory comes from the same word as manufacturing, right? And what it comes from the Latin word manu, hand, facture, to create, to make, right? And so a factory is something that makes things. That's all it is something that makes things. And a factory, therefore, could be something that makes milk. There might be animals that go into it, but it's still a factory of sorts, right? Now, more specifically speaking, a factory is a place where people make things like shoes, right? Or toys, or ugly blue chairs, right? That's ideally what a factory is. But if we think about the term itself, right, what it means, and that's why in the 19th century they tend to use the word manufactory as opposed to just factory, because people were still working with their hands and there were no production lines. But it's a fascinating thing because right around this time, 1913-ish, and we talked about this with Corbusier and the purists, Ozenfeld. Right around this time, Henry Ford has begun to figure out the production line in the production of Model A's, right, is right around 1913-ish, right? And cars go back, right? The production of cars goes back to the 1890s, some of the earliest automobiles, right? But the idea of producing them on a factory line where every step of the line produces just one part of it, and they all fit together because all the parts look exactly the same. Steering wheels, right? Axles, differentials, parts of the motor, right? If everyone looks the same, then the parts can all fit together. And that was seen as a sign of amazing progress. Right? Even though eventually something like that does replace the human element. So the benefits are still being dreamed about at this point, right? I think that's the key thing. They're sort of dreaming of the benefits. And Lenin, writing as early as 1906, is saying basically that this has the potential. And I think it's sort of the unseen of the other side of things that we're sort of used to bemoaning about the machine. But they're dreaming of the potential to where it can keep a woman carrying pills from having to slog for life, to live in squalor. Well, I'm on Malevich because Malevich is probably the single most important key to the development of constructivism. He really plays an important role in this. So we already looked at that. In around 1913, he's really adopting various kinds of art that he's been seeing in Paris. Both of these works are up in MoMA in New York. So you can see he's got purism here, and now he's moving towards synthetic cubism, where he's bringing these disparate elements together, some of them painted and some of them collaged together, right? And they're real objects as well, which is something that, well, no, I take it back. It did happen in Cubism as well. But very rarely something like a thermometer, right? A real thermometer on the surface, tickets and snippets of letters included here. One of the things that Malevich said about these things as he's working in synthetic cubism, right? Here's a good, let's put up a synthetic cubist piece so we can make the connections visually, right? He's doing very much the same thing there, as he's using the elements to try to, first he tries to divorce those elements from their original use. And he does this by truncating them, by making snippets, right? Picasso and Braque do this. They give you parts of words, because when you do that, it yanks it away from an original context, right? And putting them back together again is what creates the meaning through these snippets. And each of the snippets is intended to evoke an element of experience, right? And our experiences are the way in which we put together these different views of the world around us. And they don't have to be organized with one-point perspective, right? It's kind of the way memory works, in a way, right? We remember this, remember that. You remember a smell, you remember a touch, you remember a color, you remember a wallpaper, right? And so for Malevich, he's taking kind of some of those same ideas, but he's doing something quite different with it. It's much more nonsensical. It doesn't really come back together again. He gives it a title, right? It's a portrait of an army soldier, a reservist from the 1st Division. And we can see elements of faces and some remnants of his machine-like elements, an ear here, something that looks like a military cross at the top, right? Not quite sure what to do with the thermometer, and I think that's probably on purpose. Because what he said was that when he snippeted, that's not a word, when he excised these things, when he pulled them out of their original context, one of the things he was aiming to do was to make these individual symbols nonsensical. He didn't want them to make sense. He wanted to turn it into something closer to pure composition, right? And that by excising them, he created what he called nonsense realism. In other words, they're realistic. You can recognize where they came from, but they're nonsense. They don't make any sense at all. And these ideas that Malevich is working with is actually a direct parallel.
Do you need help with anything today, Chris?
I sure don't, but thank you. All right, see you. That's our studio assistant. I should be able to play this back to figure out where I was. Okay, let's see. These ideas that he's working with, the idea that when you take a work of an object and you remove it from its context, that you divorce some of its sense, right, its ability to convey meaning. This idea actually parallels what's going on in Russian poetry at the time. And there's a whole school of Russian poets right around 1910 called the Russian Formalists. And I think I just read this morning. This is, again, I do Renaissance. This is not my stuff. But they had this thing they called a Zaum language, Z-A-U-M, Zaum language. And what it was in Russian poetry were words and sounds divorced from syntax, divorced from meaning. And that the poetry was to evoke experience without narrating anything. So it's something of a nonsense language. And it sounds kind of like futurism, doesn't it? Zang Tun Tun, right, with Marinetti. The idea of writing sounds that are evocative, allude to things, and really conjure up sensations very strongly, but don't mean anything, right? So when Malevich talks about nonsense realism, an object that is extracted from the world around him and is, by doing so, becomes nonsense, he's really channeling ideas that are happening in poetry at exactly the same time, right? And we've talked sort of about literary elements. We've talked about how Picasso and Braque have certain similarities to studies of language in France at the time as well, about the relationship of the word as a signifier to its meaning, which is the signified, right? This is an offshoot branch of that as well, right? So many of our artists are working in rather heavy-duty and forward-looking theoretical modes, and Malevich is one of them, right? So he's making nonsense. He's removing things from their surroundings, isolating, and this is what the Russian formula said. They wanted to isolate those things in language that lead directly to sensations, right? And those don't have to be complete words. They can simply be sounds. And Malevich is doing the same thing, trying to isolate the elements that lead to sensations. So this might begin to explain why we get the big blue square at the top, isolated. Because the blue itself will conjure some association. Maybe even the form of the square can conjure an element. And then it hit him, he says. Yeah, let's just push it. Let's just go there. Now, originally when this was painted, the crack pattern wasn't there. It's sort of through time has suffered. So as painted, it would have been a solid black square, perfectly centered on a white border, right? This is the result of his attempts to isolate the parts that lead to sensations. And he calls it supremacy, or suprematism. And what he's talking about with suprematism is, first, forms that supersede nature, supreme forms. And this is really, if you think of going back to the woman with pails, where he's working with geometric shapes, right? He's now removed it that much further and simplified it down to a simple geometric shape, right? A supreme form. Better than anything that you might see, but with still some connection to it, albeit a nonsense connection. It's not meant to be anything, but a sensation, right? A sense that you have, an experience.
Is this square actually black? Or?
It was originally black, and like I said, the crack pattern that you see is from the paint through time pulling itself apart, right? But yeah, it's just a black square on a white canvas. The cracks were not planned, okay? The cracks have happened in the intervening 104 years, right? And in fact, fairly recently, when I took art history, they weren't there when I was sitting where you are, right? Or maybe we just had crappier pictures. In any event, the cracks are growing, and we're trying to solidify them. I think they've done a pretty good job of it. Right? So suprematism, right, on one hand, the supreme form, right? On the other hand, it's also the experience for you. Suprematism is the supremacy of pure sensation, the supremacy of pure feeling in art. And he writes a manifesto about this, right? How do shapes, when used properly by the artist, evoke these supreme expressions? It's hard to think of this as an expressionism in a way, isn't it? Simply because it doesn't seem particularly expressive in the way that we tend to consider that term. But he is, I'll get you in a second, Lena, he is very, very much concerned with expression and feeling. Not as a mark on a page, but as an experience that the viewer has when confronted with the work. Right? Lena.
Is he only concerned with like the shapes, or is it also like colors?
I think it's primarily the shapes, but he does work with color. And we'll see as we move our way forward that he definitely works with color. Right? But as you can see, this is as abstract as anything that we've seen so far, right? There's not much here. And as we'll see with some other details, like we saw with Mondrian, when there ain't much there, you better be careful with what you do with the stuff that is. Now, initially, it looks like he wasn't so careful here. Wouldn't lean over fat or whatever it does, makes that oil paints do that, right? But nonetheless, he's playing with it. What's also interesting is you'll notice that there's some areas, there's a secondary square, isn't there, at the bottom, that you can see through the crack, right in here. Can you see that? Right? That makes me wonder if he's applying the paint. I've seen this in other works by him, where he applies what appears to be at first a simple black square, has a lot more going on in it than meets the eye. Right? So, he wrote a manifesto about this, right? And he talked about making this picture as, this is a quote directly from him, a desperate attempt to free art from the burden of the object. Right? So he sees the idea of representing, of realism, as traditionally understood. He sees that as a burden. The relationship between the painted object and the object in the real world. That's a burden. And this is his idea to totally sever it. So these are not meant to show us anything in particular. And again, another quote from him. To the suprematist, the visual phenomena of the objective world are in themselves meaningless. There's no meaning to be found out there. Right? The significant thing is the feeling. The feeling that you get when seeing it, quite apart from the environment in which that feeling is pulled forth. So if you're going to want to nail down what sorts of feelings you get by seeing a particular scene, and you want to focus on the feeling, how do you do that when you're still showing the scene? Right? It's difficult, right? Is it successful? I don't know, but I love his stuff. And we'll see, because it's not just a thing. This is just the beginning of where he goes with this, right? A little bit of context. This was shown in exhibition, the first time it was ever shown, in 1915, called 0.10, the last futurist exhibition of paintings. We talked about how important futurism was for Russian artists. He somehow thinks of these as being futurist in a way. And when he shows us the black square, these are almost all Malevich's. In fact, we'll see this one in just a second. And I think that's it. That one's all red. But our black square, look where it is. In the corner of the room at the top. This is where, in Russian households, families would hang icons. Right, which is a quasi-abstract figure that leads you from this world to the next. And putting it up above like that, Malevich is almost proclaiming that he's making a modern icon. Something that can bridge from the physical world to the metaphysical world, to the spiritual world. This sets him apart from the Rayanists, is he's interested in spirituality, in metaphysics. And he sees this work, I think. He doesn't ever say so much, but the fact that that's where he put it. He sees it as a sort of modern icon. Allows us to experience something beyond the physical realm. And for him, that's feeling, right? The pure, supreme feeling. Now, 010, there were 10 artists, and each of them was trying to find what Malevich called the 0 degree of art. Find nothingness. Reduce art to its bare essentials. And I got to say that whenever we talk about suprematism, there were 10 artists in this show. Malevich is like the only one we ever talked about. Because, and I've seen some others next to him, he's really good. And the other ones are like, you know. And so we'll look at, I think, just 2 others to get a sense of what makes Malevich really work. Because after hitting this, he begins to multiply forms and change colors. So going back to Lena's thing, right, do the colors mean something? I think they don't in representational fashion. I don't think there's ever a one-to-one correspondence like Kandinsky might draw between blue and this, and yellow, you know, blue and spirituality, and yellow and earthliness and madness, right? I think they're being used simply to evoke sensation, right? To conjure up an expression without actually tying it down. At the same time, he's very aware of the fact that as he multiplies and scatters the forms across the canvas, that they start to evoke space, right? Even though they're just flat squares, just through overlap and arrangement, you start to get a sense of things floating in the air, right? Things floating in space. And so he chooses these titles for a great many of them that are weightlessness, airplane flying. Now, one can say, okay, I can see a wing and a tail and all of this, but that's not what it's the sensation of flying, right? Not an illustration, but an evocation of a sensation. Other paintings have these amazing titles like Magnetic Attraction, right? Suprematist composition, Magnetic Attraction, or Wireless Telegraph. And all of them are things that are not bound by the laws of gravity. They're not bound by the standard laws of physicality, right? So, Elaine, we were talking about machines, right? Here's this sort of idea that the machine is not a machine per se in Malevich's hands, although early on we saw it was. But now it becomes this device that allows us to have a different kind of experience, right? One that is that improves on our previous experiences, that allows us to see the world in a very, very different way. Right? Other times, of course, the paintings are simply suprematist composition, right, without any of these evocations. But he's working with very subtle gradations of color and form, arranged very, very meticulously and painted every bit as meticulously. Right? Both of these are also in the Museum of Modern Art. I have some good details of the one on the left, because what he's doing is very similar to what Mondrian did. So our 2 green squares up here in the right corner. First, you can see the degree to which the whites are not just simply rolled on, but rather meticulously built up in layers and layers and layers to give you a sense of texture as well as form. But also small things, right? The upper green square slightly comes together. It's not entirely a rectangle per se. And the space between it and the blue, can you see this? There's a white that's painted actually on top of the green. Can you make that out in this projection, right? And on the top of the blue as well. That he's working up the different forms everywhere we look, and with great meticulousness. I don't know how well you can see this. You can see it on my PowerPoint, but again, there's an off sort of a peach, warm peach-colored white laid against a much cooler bluish white. And then there are elements that appear like this bar, and it's not showing up on this projection, but there's a trace line that runs up from the bar, a pencil line, just as light as can possibly be, as if it were suspended beneath it. And again, none of this is meant to be entirely representational, but rather to evoke this feeling of weightlessness, of floating, of hanging in the air. Let's see if we can see it here. Because there's another one there, you can barely see the beginning of it there. Right? Running all the way up to here. Can you see that now? As if this were like a swing, in a way. And again, as we get close, you realize that there's a back and forth being played. On this end, the black is on top of the white. But over on this end, well, I guess no, here it is. It's on top of the white on both ends. Sorry about that. But very, very subtle. Something you might miss at first, looking at it from a distance. He sees these things as immersive experiences, where the point for you, the viewer, quite like Mondrian this way, is to leave the world behind. And the painting becomes a site where you can move from that world to this one. Let's see what's coming up. What's coming up next? Well, the next logical step, right? By 1918, white on white, where he's moving again as far as he can possibly go with these things, reducing the pictorial language to its barest possible essentials. In this case, maybe even dispensing with the idea of space and depth, which he'd been creating with many of the suprematist compositions. Again, this is also up at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. We don't have a Malevich here. There's not one in a single collection anywhere in the DC area, sadly, because it's kind of hard to think about modern art without Malevich's role within it. Again, like with Mondrian, everything is finessed. So he's very much concerned with the relationship of the floating square to the edges of the composition, the distances from the corners to each of those edges, but then also the transitional point between the cool white square and the warm white background, and the way in which that line subtly undulates. Because again, this is all you have. It's not making a reference to something in the world. It's making a reference to itself. And Malevich wants you to engage with it as an object. And in order to do that, he has to be meticulous in this particular way. He talked about the fact that what you should do as a viewer, and this is his exact words, is to swim in the white abyss. Swim in the white, free abyss. And when you do so, infinity lies before you. These are gateways to utopia, a perfect world where all of the things in the world behind us are left behind. There's only a positive future. If we know a bit about history, this is being painted in Russia in 1918. 1917, the year before this, was a very pivotal year in Russian history. That's the Red Revolution. It's the October Revolution, right? This is the beginning of the Soviet Union, where at the foundation, right, at the revolution, there must have seemed as if there was the world of possibility in front of them. That they had left the world behind, the old and the traditional, have been abandoned for an experiment. We now know a failed one. But nonetheless, in 1917, what must have seemed like a glorious experiment in trying something no one had tried before. And all that they felt was available to them at that point was hope, possibility. Right? The endless abyss, in a good way. Right? Now again, lasted for 90 years, right, as an experiment of sorts. But certainly these sort of utopian, hopeful pictures of what it means to abandon tradition, right? Strike out on something bold and new, have a particular resonance at that point, whatever your ideas might be about the Soviet experiment. Now this brings us to constructivism. The founder of constructivism, Vladimir Tatlin, was a pupil of Malevich, right? And he was actually one of the 10 artists in the 010 exhibition in 1915. And right around that time, he starts to make these strange sculptures that aren't really sculpture and are quite radical for the time in which they were done. He intends them to be the opposite of everything that sculpture was traditionally. Prior to Tatlin, sculptures were solid. Sculptures were a mass. Sculptures sat on a base. Tatlins do none of that. They hang in corners. They inhabit space. They are empty as much as they are solid. Right? They gather the space around them. So we have, and a lot of it is found in industrial materials, blocks and tackle, for example, but then cut pieces of metal and wood, all repainted in metallic colors. He is, as much as Malevich, defying tradition, breaking off into a new way of looking at things and constructing rather than, as a sculptor at least, rather than carving. Right? Built up. Certainly the idea is influenced by the Cubists, the idea of synthetic cubism in particular, which brings things together, right? Tatlin making sculptures based on those same principles. It was in 1919 when he makes this monument that he begins to formulate the ideas of constructivism. This is a model for a huge monument that was never built. So this 20-foot model is just a mock-up, right, of this model that was built to commemorate the Russian Revolution, the 3rd anniversary of the Russian Revolution, the 3rd International, right, the 3rd International celebration of the beginnings of socialism, right? And it was originally intended to be a 1,300-foot building, over twice as large as the Eiffel Tower, just to give you a sense of scale, right? 1,300-foot building. And this drawing for it gives you a sense of, there's taller buildings down below, smokestacks belching steam. They see this as a positive thing. And this incredible double helix of steel leading up to the top. Inside of which, you can see in both of these, are these geometric shapes. A cube, a pyramid, a cylinder, a hemisphere. They were motorized, and they turned in space inside the double helix, each at a different rate. And as the building was designed, the big square at the bottom, the big cube at the bottom, was going to hold a lecture hall, right, where the Soviets could have public lectures. And it would rotate one time every year, very, very slowly, right? You would hardly notice it. Directly above it was a pyramid, and this was where offices were held. And it would rotate once per month. Directly above that was an information center in the cylinder, broadcasting information out to the people via a loudspeaker. It housed radio and telegraph, and it rotated once every day. And then finally at the top is this hemisphere. It housed more radio equipment, and it actually projected messages by video or film projection onto the clouds around it as well. And it rotated once every hour. Right? Now, this is obviously never realized, although they had a copy of this in the Corcoran about 10 years ago now at a show on modernism with the motors and everything turning, which was pretty fantastic, right? But on a certain level, what Tatlin's doing is something similar to what Malevich was doing, which is to say that he's taking these forms and he's distilled them down to an essence of sorts. And as he's done that and as he's displayed them, they float in space. The solid thing, the material thing, becomes immaterial. It becomes dephysicalized. And by the materials that he's using, he makes that even stronger. Everything is glass and steel inside. So the glass on the outside would reflect light away, so you wouldn't see the solidity of the lecture hall inside. Right? It gave you this sense of an object that is made of solid materials, but appears as if it's empty, as if it's nothing but open space. And that's exactly what Tatlin says he's trying to do, and he calls this constructivism. Writes a manifesto about it. Basically, the tenets of constructivism are that, on the one hand, use modern materials. Study modern materials for their particular qualities. And construct with them. Focus on modernity. Make an art for the modern world using the most modern materials. And in order to do that, you need to study them as thoroughly as you can. But then, as you're constructing, you take these modern, solid materials and you use them in a way that they become symbolic for intellectual ideas. Right? So the solid becomes something else. The physical becomes an intellectual idea. Now, how does this work out? That's the difficult thing. This sounds like an impossible project from a design prof. You know, how do you make something solid represent something immaterial? Something without any solidity whatsoever. For Tatlin, as it was for Malevich, industry, right? Modern materials are the result of industry, is this thing that allows us to create a new utopia. Create a new world where everything is right, where we can solve the problems of the past. Now, he's not the only constructivist out there. There are quite a few others. Naum Gabo is one of them, and he's too, like Tatlin, is using industrial materials to create an anti-sculpture. Now, all of this is made from celluloid. Celluloid is an early plastic. Plastics were invented in the 1860s, right? And celluloid, do you know what celluloid is mostly used for? Or was mostly used for? Paper? No. Back in the teens and 20s, celluloid, movie film, right? Film stock is celluloid. The problem is early celluloids are horribly flammable. Really, really flammable. And because they use nitrate as part of the solution that made it work, right? And this is why a lot of early movie houses burned down. It was simply because the light was tungsten, so it was an open, flammable light, and you're putting this film right next to it. But it was seen as an utterly modern material with the potential, right? If you think about celluloid, the potential of taking something that's here and projecting it beyond that, having an imprint beyond its physical self, right? So Gabo's working in celluloid and making a sculpture of the head of a woman where he only implies the outer shell, right? The solidity is missing. And then instead what we see is into it. It's pierced. It's empty. So it's made through a study of modern materials, and it's made in a way that solids become voids. That's the metaphor for solid matter becoming intellectual matter, right? It's being dematerialized. His brother works very similarly, Antoine Pevsner. Gabo was his stage name, Naum Gabo. He was Naum Pevsner, right? And his brother, and he changed his name because they were working side by side, and they didn't want to be confused, right? Like you might on a midterm exam or something, right? But also now working with celluloid, clear celluloid in this case, and on a piece of wood that's been covered with celluloid as well. Again, with these sort of perfect half cylinders that themselves suggest machinery, with a sort of precision to the cutting that suggests the way in which it's been made by machines, but then laid out in a way that space is evoked rather than solids, turning industrial materials into intellectual matter. Right? Another work by Gabo, these are his most famous pieces, where he's working with these nylon filaments attached to plastics. Both of them moved outside of Russia in the 40s during World War II, and Gabo wound up in America, Pevsner in France, right? He's really Antony Pevsner, but Antoine because he moved to France. But these things, where he's using mathematical principles as a designing feature, is another way in which he's picking up the constructivist idea of using materials to become intellectual matter. Right? We make you take math. We all know about math, but math is really an abstract concept because math, right? How do we explain it to children? We turn it into 3 apples and you give me 2. But really it's about 3 and 2 and understanding those things abstractly, isn't it? Math is a totally intellectual and abstract practice. It has real-world applications, but it is a mental activity. And Gabo is fascinated by mathematics, fascinated by ratios. And these works where he strings the nylon from perfectly measured points along one line to perfectly measured points along another plane, creating these parabolas within are an attempt to give solidity to intellectual ideas or vice versa, to render intellectual ideas render solid things as if they were intellectual ideas. So this is constructivism, and at least we're working right toward it. The idea of industry is part of it. The idea of modern materials is part of it. But also using those materials in a way that pushes us past the physical world and into something else metaphysical. And that, I hope, makes clear why Malevich was so important for all of this. Because he's the springboard for these ideas of geometric forms that are supreme above nature and that can carry the element of feeling within them. Another view of the Phillips work here. We'll look at one more artist. I think that's all we're really going to have time for as we do this, and I'll be striking some people off of your list, but with only 10 minutes left, we probably only have time for Rodchenko, Alexander Rodchenko. Another of our constructivist artists, another artist trying to use mathematics as a way of turning a solid object into something dematerialized. In this case, he's taken a single piece of plywood. And by the way, plywood is a relatively modern material. The idea of thin veneers of wood laminated together is a technology that's not that old and fairly new at Rodchenko's time. And he's taken a single piece of plywood to make this. And what he did with the plywood was simply to cut a series of concentric ovals in the board, right? You know what I'm saying when I say that? Like nested Russian dolls. So you've got the board and you just cut an oval and an oval inside of it, an oval inside of that, an oval. You get the idea, right? And then He simply turns them on axis and wires them together, right? So if you could collapse this down, right, into a single flat surface again. But he's expanded it out so that that one piece of solid material is now dematerialized, right? It now occupies space. And in fact, it dominates the space around it because light goes through it and casts shadows as well. It doesn't move, right, other than turning in space this way. But the individual parts are frozen where they are, right? They've been fixed by Rodchenko. And he does quite a few of these. And then he paints the plyboard. It's not enough that the plyboard itself is a new material. But he sands the edges and he paints it with aluminum paint, right, to make it look as if it were fabricated out of metal. Right? So again, this is a constructivist embrace of industry. And the constructivist love of turning solids into voids, turning solids into emptiness, is something that we see Rodchenko doing as well. He had studied under Malevich. He had studied with Tatlin. I mean, there's a direct connection between all of these artists, right, working together. We have one Malevich in the National Gallery. It's a painting on wood. And it's fascinating because it's kind of the same idea of our 3D piece in that it's a piece of wood, and he's left the wood grain so we can see it, but it's been altered to look like a machine in certain parts of it, with these machine-like forms, right? The discs and the gears around the outsides of them all come together to make the work appear as if it's the effects of the machine on the natural world, right? It's been manipulated for that, leaving the grain visible.
So this is a paint.
This is a painting on wood, yeah.
Yeah, I think you said it was Malevich.
Did I say Malevich?
Yeah.
Well, it's Rodchenko. It's what it says up there. Sorry about that.
That's
End of the day. Same as this guy on the right. My bad. You're right. It's not Malevich. It's Rodchenko, as it says on the slide. Yeah. And so, because Malevich is only early on interested in machinery, right? He's more interested in those geometric forms. Yeah. Now, Rodchenko, and this is sort of how we'll wrap it up for Rodchenko, is best remembered as a photographer. In fact, he gave up painting altogether fairly early on, 1921 or so. He stopped painting and turned only to the camera. And has these amazing, we still refer to these in film and in photography as constructivist compositions, where he's upsetting the normal view. No horizontal horizon line, right? Everything on angles with sort of surprising cropping and surprising viewpoints that make them just really exciting photographs. And when we look at them, right, we start to see forms instead of structures. Does that make sense? So the man climbing the fire escape on the left, and we look at the building above, the fact that the building is hanging from the top dematerializes the building. And you end up looking at it as a rectilinear shape covered with these trapezoids, rather than as a building. He's using his photography for exactly the same element. The right, the guard at the Shukov Tower, gives us this image where the tower itself, this structure of modern materials, as is the fire escape, a structure of modern materials. All of a sudden we become aware of how interested Rodchenko is in the spaces between, in the space that's occupied by that solid rather than the solid itself. Right? So our guard on the right looks almost like he's inside a web of these amazing iron rods, and it's all accomplished through his interest in photography. Right? He said this was the camera was for him the great freedom. He had this great quote. He said, "Let me leave Rubens behind." Rubens was this Baroque painter, 17th century Baroque painter, whose figures are big and fleshy, and he's sort of incredibly well known, but traditional by the 20th century, very traditional painting, and very reveling in the physical world. Right? And he's trying to get away from that. He's trying to move past that. And photography, he said, for him was exactly the way to do that. Now, he went further with his photographs. He ended up developing, or one of the major people to develop the idea of photomontage. It's very much like collage, but instead of actually collaging bits, you do it through photo exposure, right? So the things are collaged on the negative that's then exposed. And this, have you seen this before? This is so famous, right? And people rip it off all the time, right? And it's an ad for a bookstore, and she's screaming books, but it's his own photograph, now applied with these colors around it, right? And Rodchenko moves us from this spiritual idea that we were focusing on with Galbo, Pevsner, and even the legacy of Malevich, Tatlin, all very much interested in how constructivism can be spiritual. For Rodchenko, constructivism needed to be democratic. Constructivism could project messages to the masses. And through his photomontages, he's able to take these constructivist elements and flip them back to a more pragmatic, physical world and bring representation back in a way that had been lost earlier on. Wonderful graphic designer, just absolutely fantastic. I could spend hours talking about Rodchenko. Used all of his own photographs for these. This is a book cover, as you can see, a book of love poems filled with these photo montages, poems by the author, Mayakovsky, to that woman there, Lily Brink. And her picture appears repeatedly, as does Mayakovsky's. There they are in a cute little bed down below, but all done through photo montage, where he is bringing these photos together, again, with the idea that each one evokes an idea, a feeling, but does so in a much more tangible way. So here's a good last slide to end with, right? For Malevich, he excerpted things from the world, and he found these supreme forms that for him presented a way of bridging the physical world with the world of expression, emotion, right? That allowed us to transcend this plane for something metaphysical. And many of the design principles that become constructivism, Rodchenko is using as well. But what he's using is, instead of these supreme forms that abandon references to the world, focus solely on expression, he's going back to this Zaum idea that we talked about from Russian poetry, where each of the snippets evokes part of it, separated and recombined in a way that allows meaning to be reconstructed as experience rather than as narrative. So he takes single words, single ideas, single feelings from the poems and makes these collages to illustrate them. But as we see them side by side, I think you can see quite clearly that Rodchenko's design sense remains this constructivist idea, with its roots going back to supremacism. Now, with only about 2 minutes left, I'm not going to jump into the other artists that we had on the list. We've got Lazitsky and more Kandinsky. They'll just have to wait. It makes sense to wait, right? That means some other artists will come off of your slide list. I have to go be at an event right now, so I'm not going to be able to do it right away. But after 4 o'clock, I'll go up and update the slide list. I bring it home. And at that point, you'll know, and I'll email you what I've updated, right? But I'll do strike-throughs like I did with the German Expressionists. And I'm around all day Thursday, and most of the day tomorrow, if you have any, and Friday morning before the exam. So if you have last-minute questions, please email me. But best of luck studying, and, I mean it. If you have questions, let me know.